So, welcome back. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Ken Miller, who's going to give us the keynote symposium talk tonight. Before we begin, I want to remind you that this is just the beginning of the Darwin festivities, and we'll be back here tomorrow at 8:15 to hear another series of great talks, kicking off with David or Michael Lynch tomorrow at 8:15. David Lynch is his other evil brother, half-brother. No. That'll be capped tomorrow evening at 8 o'clock by Archbishop Szynski, who's going to give the keynote talk tomorrow evening, 8 o'clock. Mark it down. And Tuesday, we also have a great series of talks that are going to be capped off by an 8 o'clock symposium. In this case, it's going to be over in Jordan Hall 105, not here in McKenna. And Dr. or Professor Simon Conway Morris is going to be delivering the finale to the Darwin celebration. So, Dr. Miller joins us today from Brown University, where he got his BS in 1970. He then went to the University of Colorado, where he got his PhD, to be followed by a period where he taught and did research at Harvard University, in particular on biological membranes. After this time, Dr. Miller returned to his alma mater at Brown and launched another career in addition to his scientific career as a public advocate of science, in particular evolutionary biology and criticism of creationism and intelligent design. He wrote 2 seminal books on the subject, including Finding Darwin, as well as more recently, Only a Theory. He's won numerous awards, and he's an important public celebrity, in fact. He's been on any number of shows from PBS through the Today Show. He was, most importantly, on Comedy Central, where he was, in fact, he's a regular guest on the Stephen Colbert Report. In his spare time, he's also managed to be the lead expert witness for the plaintiffs in the Kitzmiller versus Dover area Board of Education trial, Dover, Pennsylvania, where he managed to convince the judge that it wasn't such a great idea to teach intelligent design in the classroom. So, Notre Dame Nation, let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Ken Miller. If we're really nice to him, he may show us his Peabody in addition to maybe in addition to the flagellum and other sort of even more basal bodies. Today, Ken's going to talk to us about God, Darwin, and design, evolution, and the battle for America's soul. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a real honor to be here and to address this very distinguished group of scientists and intellectuals, and especially to address everyone who's come tonight for the public keynote. I do indeed appreciate it. One never knows how one is going to be introduced, so I always like to bring my own introductory slide along so I can correct things. Although what you heard was largely accurate, so I don't have too much to correct. I am a cell biologist. I do most of my work with the electron microscope. I work on biological membrane structure and function. And you might wonder, how does a cell biologist get involved in the whole evolution thing? Well, there are a lot of answers to that, but one part of the answer is if you allow yourself to be talked by a former student into doing something absolutely outrageous, all sorts of consequences will follow. In my case, the former student was a wonderful guy named Joseph Levine, and what Joe talked me into, although it took him 6 months to do it, was writing a book with him. And some of the younger people in the audience, and certainly some of you who are in education, may recognize that book and several others. But Joe and I have written a whole series of high school biology textbooks which are widely used in the United States, Canada, even Mexico, and many other different countries. It was an interesting experience for both of us. And you might wonder whether an author of a textbook actually knows how the book is used and received by students. Well, I do. I've been blessed with two daughters. My oldest, Lauren, who's a wildlife biologist, actually managed to graduate from Dighton-Rehoboth Regional High School in Massachusetts, where we live, before my first book came out. I think that's why Lauren is a biologist today. Tracy, my younger daughter, was not so lucky. I always tell people she's the daughter of whom I do not speak, because today she is a history teacher. But nonetheless, it's an interesting experience to have a book that you wrote used in the schools in your own community. Now, I live in a town called Rehoboth, Massachusetts, which is actually one of the oldest communities in the United States, actually founded in 1643. Although it's very small, it's only about 8,000 people. And for quite a few years, people in that town knew who I was. But it wasn't because of what I did for a living. It was because for almost 10 years, I was sort of the commissioner of the girls' softball program. So I would run the spaghetti suppers to raise money. I trained our umpires. In the summer, I used to coach one of our all-star team. So everybody knew me as the softball guy, but they didn't know what I did for a living. One day, the high school adopts those books. My name is on the cover. My picture's inside. My cover is blown. I drive up to the high school about a month into that school year. I'm picking up Tracy after field hockey practice, and there's a woman that I know from softball, Bonnie Kelly, a fellow coach, standing in front of the high school. So I pull up, and Bonnie flags me down, and Bonnie says, Ken, you wrote the book that they use in the high school. And I smiled, and I puffed out my chest, and I said, yes, Bonnie, I did. And then she looked me straight in the eyes, and she said, funny thing is, you don't seem that smart. So I was never quite sure what to make of that, but obviously you get to decide that tonight. As you've heard, I've also written a couple books for general audiences. The first one was called Finding Darwin's God, a scientist's search for common ground between God and evolution. People had urged me to write this book because I've been speaking on this subject for several years. And finally, I broke down and did it. And I thought it would be a little book. And what I mean by that is there was a lot of stuff I wanted to get out there. I thought Mom and Dad would buy a copy. My department chairman would be amused to see a book like this on the CV of a cell biologist, and that would be pretty much it. To my absolute astonishment, this book is now in its 29th printing in paperback. It's been translated and will come out this year in French. It's going to be published in Croatian, next year in Spanish. And what it tells me more than anything else is that people are really eager to see someone address these issues at the interface of science and religion. Now, a lot has happened since I wrote that book, and this past year I published a book called Only a Theory, Evolution and the Battle for America's Soul. And many of the themes I'm going to talk about tonight are discussed or at least pointed out in that particular book. Now, I think it's fair to say, and this is really a public keynote, that evolution is an issue that divides Americans. And if you would like to do some research on this, I would recommend an issue of Time magazine a couple of years ago, in which it was pointed out that actually in many surveys, most Americans seem to reject the theory of evolution. It was pointed out that our president at the time, George W. Bush, had spoken out on this issue, not in a particularly helpful way, at least from my point of view. But look carefully at this. My co-author pointed this out to me. Look at whose textbook Time magazine superimposed President Bush's face on. That's actually our textbook. And I like that because I'm always looking for new cover art for our book. And in a couple of years, we're going to be selling books in Texas, and this might turn out to be a winner. So you never know about these things. But just to illustrate the intensity of this, in the space of just 12 months, I actually ended up in federal court talking about the teaching of evolution in our schools in these two states, in Georgia and Pennsylvania. About a year later, evolution was the issue in two other American states. Those were Ohio and Kansas. It was the issue in these states in the elections for state boards of education. Both of these states elect their state boards. And if you wonder, what does an election sound like that's actually played out just around the issue of evolution? I'm going to show you. This is from the front page of the largest newspaper in Ohio, about 10 days before the '06 election. Normally low-profile contest in Spotlight, evolution debate at the center of the school board race, and it highlighted the race for the seat in Akron between the incumbent, an anti-evolutionist named Deborah Owens Fink, and her pro-evolution opponent, a guy with the very memorable name of Tom Sawyer. You just can't make this stuff up. So here's what a talk show host in Cleveland told his listeners was at stake. He told them, if you believe in God, creation, and true science, vote for Debbie. If you believe in evolution, abortion, and sin, vote for her opponents. Now, with rhetoric like that, you might think the poor pro-evolution guy didn't have a chance. But as it turns out, pro-evolution candidates swept the Board of Education races in Ohio, and they also won the Board of Education races in Kansas. And what happened in both of those states, I think, is an object lesson to all of us in the scientific and educational community. And that is, we have to come out of the classroom, out of the laboratory, if you will, climb down from the ivory tower, and when we do, the American people will choose science every time. But only if those of us who care about this issue make an effective political presentation. And that's something I think all too often scientists are shy about doing. Now, if I also take my map of the United States and I color in those states in which anti-evolution measures have been passed in at least one house of the state legislature, we color in a lot more states. And if I then focus on anti-evolution activities at the local level, we color in virtually the entire country. This is a national issue. This is not regional. It's not just something in flyover country. This is an issue that stirs emotions everywhere in the United States. Now, some of you might say, and I think rightly so, didn't we solve all of this in 1925 with the Scopes trial? I mean, you know, even if you don't remember the details of the trial, surely you saw Inherit the Wind, and you understand the confrontation between William Jennings Bryan and Clarence Darrow, and presumably the anti-evolution forces were ridiculed so much publicly in that trial that that settled the issue. But unfortunately, the reality of that trial was that the ACLU lost that trial, John Scopes was convicted, and the Butler Act, under which he was prosecuted, stayed on the books. And it stayed on the books for more than 40 additional years. Teaching evolution remained banned in 6 American states. The only thing that ended it was the courage of a second-year biology teacher named Susan Epperson, who, when she took her teaching appointment at Central High School in Little Rock and discovered her department chair rejected lesson plans that included evolution because it was against state law, she decided to sue her own state. She won that case in the lower courts. The state of Arkansas appealed to the state Supreme Court. They reversed the decision, and Susan then took this to the Supreme Court of the United States. Epperson versus Arkansas was the case under which all of these laws, including the one in force in Tennessee in 1925, were finally thrown out. The biggest thrill that I had participating in the Kitzmiller versus Dover trial, which I'll talk about in a bit, was I got an email from Susan Epperson. I didn't even know she was still alive. She's an adjunct professor of chemistry at the University of Colorado in Colorado Springs, and she asked me to autograph one of my books. Would I autograph it if she mailed it to me? I looked at that email, and I emailed her back, and I said, you don't have to tell me who you are. You are a rock star. I will autograph that book under one condition, and it's non-negotiable. You have to send me an autographed picture of yourself, which I can then hang in my office as a souvenir. So about 2 weeks later, package comes, there's the book, I sign it, and I look at the photograph. And I can't quite figure out the photograph. And what we have is a picture of a very pretty young girl, that's obviously Susan, and she had signed it, and this old guy. Now, I don't know if any of you can recognize him, but I did not recognize the old guy, and I had to flip the picture over on the other side, and Susan had written, this is a picture of me and John Scopes. Because it turns out Scopes, same reaction I had, it's just a chill went down my spine. And at that point, I realized I have to fly to get to Colorado so I can get a picture of myself next to Susan Epperson. And lo and behold, that's exactly what I did. But nonetheless, this means we now have victory, that these laws are gone. Well, as it turns out, not really. And the reason for that is that what happened is in the 1960s, a strategy emerged that its advocates called balanced treatment. And the idea was not so much to ban evolution as to present what its proponents, regarded as a scientific view of creation. And this is a textbook that was offered, as you can see, for use in the public schools on scientific creationism. They then sought the help of state legislatures around the country to require balanced treatment for this. And this is, in fact, the text of a bill enacted in the state of Arkansas. 2 American states voted to require the teaching of creation science whenever what the bills called evolution science was taught in the schools, and Arkansas was one of those states. What happened several years after this was passed was a case known as McLean versus Board of Education. A Methodist minister in Arkansas with children in the public schools sued the state, arguing that this particular act was unconstitutional. The heroes of this trial, in addition to Bill McLean, the courageous plaintiff, were an extraordinary series of philosophers, theologians, and scientists who made the case for science in a federal court. These people included a very young Stephen Jay Gould, a young professor of philosophy named Michael Roos, and I can't quite place the other guy, but a young dashing geneticist who you heard earlier this afternoon. This is the young Francisco Ayala. And I couldn't resist from pointing out the pivotal role that Dr. Ayala played in this particular trial. So what happened, and this was a highly publicized trial, reported all over the country, what happened was this group won. And the judge struck down the Arkansas creationism law. I will tell you what happened to the Louisiana law in a little bit. It remains in effect for the time being. So you might think that now we've won, surely everything is okay. But once again, a new strategy emerges. The strategy this time is something that its proponents call intelligent design. And the idea is if you avoid references to a creator and you emphasize the daunting complexity of living things, maybe you can make connections to an unnamed designer so that students will simply assume that you're talking about the creator without naming him. The textbook was presented, once again like the other textbook, to advance this point of view. It was called Of Pandas and Peoples, the Central Question of Biological Origins, and this book was published explicitly to support high school courses in intelligent design. Now, before I go any further, I want to make a definition, because we should understand exactly what intelligent design means. And I'd like to start off by saying what I think it does not mean. And that is, I would argue that theists, people who believe in a divinity of any sort, I would say by definition, think that there is some sort of an intelligence or logic to existence. And they might express that from time to time as a view that there is something that you might call an intelligent design to the universe. And for what it's worth, that is a view that I hold myself. But it's important to understand that that is not what is meant by intelligent design in its current context in the US and in other countries. What is actually meant is a quite different proposition. It's the claim that what its advocates call design, by which they mean outside intelligent intervention, is required to account for the origins of living things. This means intelligent design is not this very general consideration of meaning and purpose in existence. It is instead a doctrine of special creation. Now, why do I call it a doctrine of special creation? Here's why. When one says, for example, that the animals of the Cambrian period were designed, or the bacterial flagellum, or the proteins that clot our blood were designed, they don't just mean they were designed. They mean they were literally brought into existence by a force acting outside of nature. What's the word for bringing into existence? The answer is creation. So it is, in fact, an argument for the special creation of these organisms. Its advocates say that the reason this idea cannot get a fair hearing is because science is closed to new ideas that conflict with what they call the Darwinian paradigm. Now, I think what that argument overlooks is that science deals with new ideas all the time. It is basically the lifeblood of scientific research. And when someone makes a new scientific claim, what they do quite naturally is they do research to back it up. They try to figure out if they can find evidence, conduct experiments to support it. They then submit that work to peer review. Now, peer review doesn't just mean you write up a paper and you send it to a journal for your peers to review it. Peer review in its broadest sense means that you partake of the scientific dialogue. You go to meetings, you present your ideas, you take criticism, you answer the criticism, you exchange, in short, you participate in the open marketplace of ideas that has always been part of the scientific enterprise. Eventually, if your idea has merit, if the evidence is behind it, you may win a scientific consensus, either that you're right or that your idea has merit and should be considered by the scientific community, and then quite automatically, that novel scientific claim will end up in classroom and textbook. It is simply how science works, how it has always worked, and how it continues to work today. Now, the advocates of intelligent design like to say that they have a novel scientific idea too. And if they do, I think that's terrific, because I would look forward to seeing them at the cell biology meetings, the biochemical society meetings, and so forth, to discuss the evidence, to criticize them, to listen to their responses, and to subject their work to peer review. But their idea of how this theory should be treated is not like this. What they would prefer to see is something rather more like this, which is a direct injection into classroom and textbook. In short, it's an end run around the scientific process, and they really see the scientific process as best avoided. Now, as an example of an effort to do exactly this, I'm going to pick a small town in Pennsylvania. The name of that small town is Dover, Pennsylvania. And what the advocates of intelligent design did was to convince a government agency, the local school board, to insert their ideas into classroom and textbook. This is a headline from the local paper. The date is October 19th, 2004. This is a very happy date for me, by the way, because being a Boston Red Sox fan, this is one of the days when the Red Sox were busy beating the Yankees that year in the American League playoffs. So I actually, just because I didn't want to divert your attention, I cut out the headline of David Ortiz hitting a game-winning home run on this particular day. So we're going to focus in on what really matters. And what the school board did was to order the teachers in Dover to prepare a curriculum on intelligent design. Now, there turned out to be a total of 3 biology teachers in Dover High. It's a very small town. Here they are. And at the risk of being fired, they refused. They told the school board, when we became teachers in Pennsylvania, we had to sign an oath. One provision of that oath was a promise that says, I will never knowingly present false information to a student. They said, this stuff is false information. By the oath, you could fire us if we did teach it. So we will not teach it. Instead, what happened, so as I say, the teachers simply refused to do it. So the Board of Education, think about this, the Board of Education wrote their own lesson on intelligent design. They asked the teachers to read it to the students. Still they refused. They sent the assistant superintendent and the superintendent into the classroom, and they read the lesson to the students while the teachers literally stood outside in the hallway. The next morning, a group of parents were so outraged they met and decided they had to do something about it. Now, where did the school board get this idea? Did they just meet for morning coffee one day and say, let's force the teachers to teach intelligent design? The answer is, of course not. They were put up to it. And they were put up to it by an organization in Seattle, Washington, known as the Discovery Institute. Members of the Discovery Institute have written booklets like this one, Intelligent Design in the Public School Science Curricula, a legal guidebook. That's almost a playbook, step by step, for everything the Dover board did, and it also recommends purchasing that intelligent design textbook, Pandas and People, for their students. And lo and behold, that's exactly what they did. Well, the parents who were outraged about this met, and what they did was 11 parents a week later, objecting to the board's policy, filed a First Amendment lawsuit against the board in December 2004. Now, I know there are many people, many international guests here at this conference. It's wonderful to have you here. The First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States prohibits any government, state, local, or federal, from either prohibiting or restricting the free exercise of religion or establishing, endorsing a religion. And that is exactly, in the view of the parents, what the school board had done. So what followed was a very highly publicized lawsuit. These are some snapshots here from the beginning of the trial and here from the press conference in the lawsuit. The lawsuit is named for the first listed plaintiff. That is this unassuming woman over here in the blue blouse. Her name is Tammy Kitzmiller, and Tammy had 2 students, two of her daughters in biology class at the time, and therefore did have the right to take the school district to court. Now, this case moved to trial very quickly, and for proponents of intelligent design, it looked perfect. And the reason for that is, by the luck of the draw, they drew a recently appointed conservative judge named John Jones III. Now, Judge Jones is a lifelong Republican. He's a political protege of Governor Tom Ridge, and he was recommended for the bench by Pennsylvania's very conservative U.S. Senator Rick Santorum. He has a well-deserved reputation as a strict constructionist. And what they thought they would do is they'd be able, for the first time, to get, as they called them, the Darwinists under oath in court, break them down under cross-examination, and get them to admit that evolution was a lie. Here, in an NBC TV courtroom sketch, you see a representative Darwinist, namely me, under cross-examination in federal court. What actually happened in this trial was quite different. What actually happened was intelligent design simply collapsed as anything even remotely resembling a scientific theory. The trial lasted for 7 weeks. As one of the lawyers noted, I'm not making this up, 40 days and 40 nights. That was the exact... Actually, I should tell you this, although I hadn't planned to. The closing arguments, the attorney representing the school board was fumbling with his calendar as he got up to make his closing statement. This is when we knew we were going to win the case. And he looked at the calendar and said, Your Honor, I'm not sure if you realize this case has gone on for 40 days and 40 nights. And the judge looked forward and said, but it wasn't by design. So we felt pretty good at that point. Well, what happened, among other things, is the things I would call the icons of intelligent design, the examples that they used to show that evolution couldn't possibly work, including the blood clotting cascade, the bacterial flagellum, and so forth. All of the arguments based on these examples were refuted. They were simply shown to be wrong. And this was really quite dramatic. But what was even more dramatic is the way in which we were able to show that intelligent design was not just religion, but a very particular religious doctrine masquerading as science. The way in which we did that might surprise you. And that is, we used the intelligent design textbook, Pandas and People. Now, I want to assure you, when you open this book, it sounds very scientific. There's nothing in here about Genesis, the Bible, and so forth. Here, for example, is the definition of intelligent design. Intelligent design means various forms of life began abruptly through an intelligent agency with their distinctive features already intact. Fish with fins and scales, birds with feathers, beaks, and it sounds very scientific. So what the attorneys did before the trial is to subpoena the publisher. And they asked the publisher, has this book ever been published earlier? Maybe under a different name. Could you give us the earlier editions, editorial correspondence, page proofs, drafts, and so forth? They gave us 7,000 pages of material. I thought this was a waste of time. Lawyers went through it. They sent it to a fellow expert witness named Barbara Forrest, who was the real hero of this trial. Barbara called me up one day and said, sit down, Ken. I want to tell you what I just found. She told me I was laughing so hard I could barely contain myself. All I could think of was, didn't these guys learn anything from the Nixon administration? You can't leave this stuff around. You've got to burn it. What they should have burned is this. This book had appeared earlier under a different name. That's why we didn't know it. The book, paragraph for paragraph, read exactly the same as Pandas and People, with one very subtle difference. Creation means the various forms of life began abruptly through an intelligent creator. It's the same paragraph. And what these guys had done is to fire up Microsoft Word and do a find and replace the word creator with the word designer. Now you might wonder, am I being fair about that? I'm only showing one paragraph. Here's what Barbara did. She went through all the early editions of the book and she counted how many times they mentioned creator or creator, that's in red, how many times they mentioned designer, that's in blue. Early on, all about creation, nothing about design. Watch this. Bang. All of a sudden, in 1987, creation goes to zero, design goes up and takes its place. That's the Microsoft Word find and replace. Clearly, something astonishing happened in 1987. And you might wonder, what was it that happened in 1987? Well, I was speaking, actually, at the University of North Carolina last year, and I had been joking with kids in the front row, and they were telling me how brilliant they were and what a great school UNC was. So I decided, okay, I'd test them. I said, okay, you guys are so bright, do any of you know? And all of a sudden, they looked at each other, and one kid very excitedly started waving his arms. I figured he must know. I said, okay, sir, what was it? And he jumps up and he goes, I was born. What do you say to that? I said, sir, I'm sure that was remarkable, but it's not what I had in mind. Here's what actually happened in 1987. I had mentioned that the Arkansas law for creation science was invalidated in a court case. Not so the Louisiana law. The Louisiana law went all the way to the Supreme Court in a case called Edwards versus Aguillard, and the U.S. Supreme Court definitively, by a strong vote, identified creation science as inherently religious. That is what happened. So this group had a book on creationism that they wanted to sell in the public schools. All of a sudden, they can't. So what do? They've invested all this money in artwork. They've paid the authors. They got the presses ready to roll, and they can't do it. So they put it around. Somebody comes up with a bright idea. Let's call it something else. You got an idea? You got it. All of a sudden, someone says intelligent design. That's it. You do the find and replace, and then there it is. So if anyone ever tells you that intelligent design is fundamentally different from old-fashioned scientific creationism. Remind them of where this intelligent design textbook came from. A book on creationism, the creator was called the designer, and that was said to be fundamentally different. The judge saw through this in a flash. Now, some of you may have seen this television program, but for those of you who haven't, the PBS series Nova did a 2-hour special program on this that highlighted not just the scientific and legal arguments, but also the drama in the small town involved in this. And I'm going to show you a little preview of that program so you can get an idea what it was like. Here you go.
I believe there is an intelligent design. In the beginning, God created.
Saying that you don't believe in evolution is almost saying we don't believe that the Civil War ever took place in the United States.
An extraordinary court case ignites a small town.
It's like a civil war within the community, there's no question.
And puts science itself on trial.
Very important things were at stake. One is the future of science education in this country.
Nova reveals the story behind the headlines.
Anywhere you turn, we were getting attacked.
Witnesses started dropping like flies.
And probes the question, is intelligent design a scientific alternative to evolution?
Properly the subject of a science class.
Or religion in disguise?
It's a violation of everything we mean and everything we understand as science.
Judgment Day, intelligent design on trial on Nova.
Well, I hope you appreciated the drama of that narration. I discovered afterwards that TV people call that the end of the world narration. And that's really what they put in there. But this was an amazing show. I don't know if this qualifies as showing them my Peabody, but it won the Peabody Award for excellence in broadcast journalism. It was really worth watching. And as you were kind enough to mention, participation in this trial for a lot of us led to all sorts of interesting media opportunities. A couple of us were interviewed in Science Friday, the Today program, and so forth. But I, no question about it, got the strangest request for an interview, and I ended up opposite Stephen Colbert on the Colbert Report. And I have to say, I know that many of our guests here are from other countries, and they may not quite understand what the Colbert Report is. But if you miss this, or if you'd like to see it, you just Google my name and the Colbert Report. And this video clip will come right up. It's in several places on the internet. And I think if you realize the show is a satire, it's important to say that. I should mention, I'm sorry to take time for this, but I should mention that about a week after this went up on the internet, I got an email from the Oxford evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins. And what Richard wrote to me was, "Dear Kenneth, I am absolutely in awe of your powers of self-control. If I had been in that TV studio with that Mr. Colbert, I would have knocked the table over and walked out. If this gentleman is indicative of the state of journalism in the United States, then your country is in more trouble than I had suspected." Now, since then, my friend Richard Dawkins has actually been on the Colbert Report, and if you'd watch that, you'd discover he still doesn't quite get it. So let that go. But I had such a good time with Stephen that when my new book came out last year, he actually called me up and said, "Now that you have a new book out, I have an excuse to have you on again," and I went on there for a second time. And for those of you who are involved in education, I actually have a very depressing message. And here's, especially for higher education, this is a real bummer. Nothing I have ever done in my entire scientific and professional career has ever gained for me the respect with my students of being on the Colbert Report. And no matter how you think about it, that's really depressing in one way or another. Now, I haven't told you about the decision. The decision was announced just before Christmas in 2005, and the judge came down in a definitive way saying this stuff was not science. He even said the school board had displayed, his words, breathtaking inanity in implementing this policy. I didn't realize judges could talk like that. But this was reported all over the United States. It was on the nightly news of all the networks, and naturally it set off jubilation among the 11 parents who had sued the school board. And remember, it was parents who were behind this action. That's a very important thing to appreciate. Now, I would love to pretend that now that this case is over, this issue is over. But turns out it's not. And that's one of the reasons I wrote the book that I published last year. The battle isn't finished. It's the result not so much of an argument about evolution per se. It really is the result of a continuing attack against scientific reason itself. And that's a very important thing for all of us to understand. And I think that America's scientific soul our scientific future as a world leader is very much at stake. Now, let me show you what I mean. Despite what happened in Dover, intelligent design is still a public relations success story. This is one of those charts you shouldn't show at a lecture because nobody can actually read the fine print. But what you have here is a survey of about 1,000 citizens in each of 33 industrialized countries. And they were asked basically, do you accept evolution or not? If you said yes, you're in blue. And if you said no, you're in red. And if you weren't sure, you're in the color in between. Now, I don't know if you can pick out the United States on that chart, but I'll help you. We are right there. The only country we beat was Turkey. Now, in my graduate program at Brown, it turns out we have 2 absolutely terrific Turkish graduate students. They're going to make wonderful scientists when they get their PhD. I hope very much we keep them here in the United States to add to our scientific workforce. But one of them, when I was reading this article, was walking down the hallway. And I flagged him down, and I said, Batur, come in here. I want you to read this. So he reads the article, and at the end of it, he sees the graph. He puts his head in his hands, and he shakes it back and forth. He says, I am so ashamed. And I said, what's the matter? He goes, look at that. We couldn't even beat the United States. But what that tells me as much as anything else is how desperate the situation is in this country for those of us who really, really believe that a scientifically literate public is important to America's future. Now, there's something else I should tell you. This idea is not confined to the United States, because it turns out that intelligent design is another great American intellectual and cultural export that is now beginning to spread around the world. This article in Nature points about the rise of anti-evolution sentiment in Europe in general. Several articles printed in British newspapers, and this is from this month, suddenly discovered that a poll of citizens in Great Britain said that a majority of British citizens said that creationism, intelligent design should be taught in British schools. And believe it or not, the percentage who said this in Britain is higher than the percentage in the United States when asked the same question. And it also turns out it's not confined to the English-speaking world as well. Significant anti-evolution resources and propaganda have appeared in European countries as well. And for those of you who don't speak German, this says the evolution lie. And that, again, is the level of argumentation that we see. Now, what's the basis for this appeal? I think in many respects, intelligent design creationism appeals to people because it seems to fill a vacuum in human understanding. And it's a vacuum that's formed by any fossil, any structure, or any biochemical process that is not yet fully explained by evolution. Intelligent design seems to explain everything. You just say the designer did it. And the other thing about that vacuum is the vacuum is made threatening by a view of evolution that many people take that is hostile to values held by many Americans. Now, if you wonder, what is that view of evolution that could be so threatening? All you have to do is to poke around on the web or read anti-evolution publications, and you will see things like this. Don't teach our kids they come from apes. That's apparently the native behavior of an ape with a Bowie knife here. Or something like this. And again, this is widely regarded by many anti-evolution organizations as what evolution means. Life is an accident. It has no meaning. People are just animals. There is no God. What, according to these critics, does this lead young people to do? It leads them to do this. In other words, we have killings in our schools not because of issues with gun control, parental control, or school discipline, but rather because kids are taught evolution. And in fact, several anti-evolution organizations have made this explicit. Answers in Genesis, the largest anti-evolution organization in the world, these are the guys with the Creation Museum in northern Kentucky, after a school shooting a couple years ago, said, as a society, why did the shooting occur? Darwin. As a society, we reap the consequences of the unquestioned acceptance of the belief in evolution every day. It diminishes your worth and reduces human beings from being made in the image of God to being mere players in the game of survival of the fittest. Evolution is portrayed not just as wrong, but as genuinely dangerous. So how do we win the evolution wars? How do we answer these sorts of questions? And I would argue that it requires really a two-pronged strategy. One is to focus on the scientific evidence for evolution, which is overwhelming, and to popularize that evidence. And by popularize, I simply mean take the message to the public in a way that everyone can understand. But the second thing, which I also think is important, is by stressing the distinction between science and belief. And I don't just mean religious belief. Many interpretations of evolution have been advanced by individuals in the name of science, and those interpretations are themselves not always scientific. And I will give a few examples of that in a moment. So let's take the first point first, the scientific evidence. Weapon number one in the arsenal of intelligent design, no argument, is intentional distortion. No better example of that than that book, Pandas and People. Here are a couple pages from Pandas and People that focus on the fossil record. And they tell students, 14-year-old kids, that evolutionists are so stupid that they actually think the first tetrapods, the first land vertebrates, evolved from lobe-finned fishes like this Eusthenopteron here. And they go further. They say, do you really think that a limb like this could magically change into one that could support the whole body like this? And here's the actual text. They ask students, how many different transitional species were required to bridge this gap? We don't know. But we do know that no such transitional species have ever been recovered. No transitions between these two forms. In graphic terms, here's their argument. On the line from fish to land vertebrates, you have lobe-finned fish like Eusthenopteron. You have early amphibians, tetrapods, four-legged land vertebrates like Ichthyostega, and no transitional species between them. Even at the time this book was published, there's no other word for it, and I'm sorry to be coarse, that statement was a lie. It turns out that there were two very well understood transitional forms already reported in the literature between them, Panderichthyes and Acanthostega. So far from being an unbridgeable gap, the reality is it's a very well understood evolutionary transition. But tonight I want to go even further. I want to focus in right here in these two other transitional forms, and in particular I'd like to ask, can we find yet another transitional form in between them? Now Panderichthyes was a lobe-finned fish, but it had limbs that were so robust that it could actually lift itself out of the water. The muscular attachments show that. Acanthostega is an amphibian, but it is the most fish-like amphibian that has ever lived. It had a fish-like tail, a fish-like head, and it had internal gills, which no living amphibian has today. All of these illustrate its piscine or fishy ancestry. But to answer this question, I'm going to show you a little video clip featuring a scientist who led an expedition to find exactly such a transitional form.
1999, paleontologist Neil Shubin and his colleagues set out to find just such a creature.
What evolution enables us to do is to make specific predictions about what we should find in the fossil record. The prediction in this case is clear-cut. That is, if we go to rocks of the right age and the rocks of the right type, we should find transitions between two great forms of life, between fish and amphibian.
Armed with this prediction, Shubin and his colleagues organized an expedition to one of the most desolate places on Earth, the Canadian Arctic, about 500 miles from the North Pole, where rocks of just the right age are exposed.
Money was running out. This was it. We were told this was our last year up there. And then in 2004, in the third day of the season, a colleague of mine was removing rock and discovered a little snout sticking out the side of the cliff, just like exactly like this. And he removed more rock and more rock and more rock, and it became clear this was a snout of a flat-headed animal. And that's when we knew, flat-headed animal at 375 million years old, this is going to be something interesting.
They called it Tiktaalik, which means large freshwater fish in the language of the local Inuit people. And it's one of the most vivid transitional fossils ever discovered, showing how land animals evolved from primitive fish.
Over here you have a fish about 380 million years old. And we see, just like any good fish, it has scales on its back and fins. You compare that to an amphibian, you find a creature that doesn't have scales, and it's modified the fins to become limbs, arms and legs. And the head's very different. It has a flat head with eyes on top and a neck. What we see when we look at the fossil record, at rocks of just the right age, there's a creature like Tiktaalik. Just like a fish, it has scales on its back and fins. You can see the fin webbing here. Yeah, when you look at the head, you see something very different. You see a very amphibian-like thing with a flat head with eyes on top. It gets even better when we take the fin apart. When we look inside the fin, as in this cast here, what you'll see is bones that compare to our shoulder, elbow, even parts of wrist, bone for bone. So you have a fish at just the right time in the history of life that has characteristics of amphibians and primitive fin.
So it's such a good intermediate form, it's almost as though you drew it up on a drafting table. And as it turns out, even while Neil and his colleagues were publishing this form, another group had found yet another transitional form in exactly the same series. This one was more on the fishy side of the transition. It's called Goganathus, and it's really quite striking because what we now have is a situation where we started out like this. We understood this transition very well. Tiktaalik fits neatly in this part of the transition, and Goganathus fits in perfectly right here. With respect to all of this, I have a former student named Colin Perrington who teaches at Swarthmore College, and a couple years ago we were chatting about this stuff, and he said, Ken, you're too wordy. Next time you get in a debate or an argument or testimony, don't show a lot of slides, don't talk RNA, don't talk DNA. End it all with one sentence. And I said, what sentence is that? He says, don't worry, it's short. I'll send it to you on a bumper sticker. And here's the bumper sticker I got from him. We have the fossils, we win. End of story. And I think that's a very good way to put it. Now, the truth is, I'm much more of an RNA, DNA guy than a fossil guy. And in fact, right before the Dover trial, Nature published the DNA sequence of the chimpanzee genome. I read the articles in this issue, and I called up the lawyers and said, gentlemen, this is a gift from God, and we have to bring this into the trial, and I meant absolutely no irony by that. Lead article. More than a century ago, Darwin and Huxley proposed that we share recent common ancestors with the African great apes. Modern molecular studies have spectacularly confirmed this prediction, and indeed they had. But as it turns out, we didn't just need what was in this issue. We already knew, for a variety of reasons, that the hypothesis of evolutionary common ancestry was written all through our genome. I want to show you an example that has not been very widely publicized, and actually surprisingly few people seem to know about. All placental mammals, like us, go through a developmental stage, shown here in a sketch from Grade's Anatomy, in which the embryonic plate develops above a tissue known as the yolk sac. All vertebrates produce a yolk sac, and in birds and reptiles, it surrounds the yolk. But the yolk sac of a placental mammal is empty. It is a hollow balloon. There's no yolk in the yolk sac. This is a micrograph, actually, of an early primate embryo, and the embryo's on the right. You can see part of its tail here. And the yolk sac is this big empty balloon right there. Now, why is that significant? It's significant because all of us mammals are descended from organisms that did lay yolky eggs, like reptiles. We go through a developmental stage in which we still form the yolk sac, but the yolk sac is empty. Now, that's a morphological correspondence. The genetic correspondence is even better. It turns out that yolk is made up of a kind of protein called vitellogenin. There are in chickens 3 genes for vitellogenin. They've got it because they produce yolk. We don't produce yolk, but if we're descended from organisms that once produced yolk, there's a possibility that the fragments, the remnants of those genes are still in our genome. And this is a paper that appeared earlier this year in the Public Library of Science, the biology version of it, and lo and behold, it searched for vitellogenin genes in a whole series of vertebrates. Lo and behold, we have pseudogenes, broken remnants of all 3 yolk genes that are found in egg-laying vertebrates. The genes are called VIT1, 2, and 3. We actually have, all placental mammals do, pseudogene remnants of all 3. VIT1 and VIT2 were lost first about 170 million years ago, and we can tell this by the number of genetic errors that have built up in these genes. And VIT2 was lost much more recently, about 70 million years ago, suggesting that the earliest mammals continued to produce egg with a certain amount of yolk in it. There is absolutely no reason for our genome to have remnants of genes that once produced egg yolk when we ourselves never produce egg yolk, any more than there's any reason for us to have a yolk sac when we have no yolk to surround it. So that's a combination, a beautiful one, of morphology, development, and genetics. But I think in many ways, one of the most dramatic things actually comes out of that paper with the chimpanzee genome. And we had to work on this because we wanted to figure out a way to explain this in terms, to put it as we did, that were so simple that even an attorney could understand them. So here's what we tried to do. This is actually a slide I used in court. We've known that we've shared recent common ancestors with these guys, but there's something funny about that. We humans carry 46 chromosomes, and all the biologists in the room know that that means you got 23 from mom and 23 from dad. All the other great apes, without exception, have 48 chromosomes. 24 from mom, 24 from dad. So why are we missing a pair of chromosomes? Is there a possibility that in the line that led to us, a pair of chromosomes, just got trashed, left behind? The answer is no. There are too many important genes on every primate chromosome, so that the loss of both members of a homologous pair, as it's called, would be fatal. You wouldn't even get past embryonic development. So the only reasonable possibility is the two chromosomes that are still separate in the other primates got accidentally stuck together to form a single chromosome in us. There's a name for that. It's called a Robertsonian translocation, and it happens all the time in other animals. If that did it, it would drop us from 24 pairs down to 23. So that's the explanation that is consistent with common descent. But here's the cool part. This is why evolution is science and not just conjecture. If that really happened, it had to happen recently, and it's testable. And what I mean by that is somewhere in our genome, we must carry around the remnants of that fusion event. Now, how would we find it if it was really there? It's easier than you might think. The tips of every human chromosome have very special repeating DNA sequences on them called telomeres. I colored that in blue. Near the center of every human chromosome is an equally special and very recognizable region called a centromere. If one of our chromosomes was formed by the fusion of two previously separate chromosomes, you know what you'd have? Telomere DNA in the center and two centromeres, which no other chromosome has. All we got to do now is scan our genome. Do we have such a chromosome? I won't leave you in suspense for very long. It's human chromosome number 2. Human chromosome number 2 has everything I just told you it had to have. Telomere DNA in the center, two centromeres. Those centromeres correspond to the centromeric sequences in primate chromosomes 12 and 13. So profound is that homology that what used to be called by geneticists chimpanzee chromosome 12 and 13, those two chromosomes are now called 2A and 2B because they correspond precisely those two halves of the human genome. Is there any way that these facts, and DNA sequences are not theories and not hypotheses, they are facts, any way that these facts could be aligned with the idea that our species was uniquely created or specially designed? The answer is no. The only way to explain all of this, including the egg yolk genes, is in fact evolution. So that's a way of going through the evidence and trying to let people say why we feel this way. But the second weapon, as I mentioned, is a kind of religious fear of evolution itself. And I thought a really good example of that was a statement, quite a reasonable statement, made by Senator Rick Santorum. He's a former senator now, but he's the very senator who recommended Judge Jones for the bench. And Rick Santorum wrote a book a couple years ago called It Takes a Family. He was interviewed about it on National Public Radio, and he was asked by the interviewer, why, in part of this book, are you so critical of evolution? Here's what he said. He said, evolution, has huge consequences for society. I mean, it's where we come from. Does man have a purpose? Is there a purpose for our lives? Or are we just simply, the result of chance? Then he went on. He said, if we're the result of chance, if we're simply a mistake of nature, that puts a different moral demand on us. Then he thought for a second, said, in fact, it doesn't put a moral demand on us, then if in fact we are a creation of a being that has moral demands. And when I heard that in the radio, I thought, that's it. That is what bothers people so much, because he's saying evolution says we are mistakes. If we are mistakes, our presence is not intended, and the whole idea of morality is up in the air. And by morality, I just don't mean don't do sex, drugs, and rock and roll. By morality, I mean what is the just society? How should we treat the poor? Under what conditions are we justified in war? These are all moral questions. And I'm glad that politicians like Santorum are seeking the answers to those questions. I think we want that in all of our leaders. But I want to address that concern. If evolution says we're a mistake of nature, then it's a very disturbing idea indeed. So here's the question. Is evolution really driven by mistakes? An awful lot of my colleagues in biology would say, sure, of course it is. And the reason for that is mutations are mistakes. They're errors in copying genetic information. They produce variation, the raw material upon which evolution acts, so evolution depends upon mistakes. But when I was an undergrad, I had a terrific biochemistry professor named Frank Rothman. And he asked us all that, and we all said, yeah, it's driven by mistakes. And Frank said, okay, well, that's cool. Mistakes are bad. Not making mistakes is good. Imagine an organism that never made what you are now calling a mistake. always copied its DNA perfectly, unchanged, from one generation to another. That should be a good thing, right? Well, if there are no mutations, no changes in genetic information, you also will have absolutely no adaptation. You'll never be able to change in response to an environmental crisis. That means you will simply not evolve, and before long, you will go extinct. And the reason for that is genetic inflexibility is fatal. So then Professor Rothman said, maybe those mutations are not mistakes. Maybe the real mistake would be not to make any mistakes. And sorting that around, I would put it this way. I don't think evolution is a mistake of nature. It's an essential element of what you might call, if you would, the design of nature. It is, in effect, the way that nature is supposed to work. Now, I really think this is an important point because I think there's a key insight here, and that is the claim that evolution is what many people call a chance random process is really at the heart of objections to what many people say about Darwinism. And I want to say tonight, I want to sort of close talking about scientifically by pointing something out. Evolution isn't random. And I think this is a point later on in this conference that Simon Conway Morris will make as well. And on this point, I'm largely in agreement with Simon. Here's the reality. We live in a material world. This is one of the few things that Madonna got consistently right. We live in a material world. Life is material, and the capacity for life is literally built into the physics and chemistry of matter. What this means, therefore, is that evolution is not a mistake. It's an inherent, and it's a predictable property of nature. What evolutionary processes do is they engage in a series of creative acts. Evolutionary processes explore what biologists call adaptive space. And in their exploration of adaptive space, they are driven by non-random natural selection and by natural law, which is far from random. These are the processes that genuinely drive evolution. Now, this is not just my idea. This is really cutting-edge thinking, not by me, but by many of my colleagues in cellular and molecular biology. To buttress that statement, I want to point out a really excellent book written by two of my colleagues, Mark Kirshner, who's a colleague and friend of mine at Harvard, and John Gerhardt from Berkeley. They wrote a book called The Plausibility of Life. Now, I regret something, and that is this was not a book intended for popular audiences. This was a book intended for biotech geeks like me. But in this book, they argued that it's a mistake to think of evolution itself as a series of mistakes. And what they said, in essence, is that the organisms alive today, including ourselves, have been selected by nature for something they call evolvability. Things that are alive today have shown the capacity to evolve. That's why they're around. So a capacity for change is not the result of so-called mistakes, but of the molecular architecture of life itself. And we and every other living organism are among life's winners who have mastered the trick of evolvability. So the reality is that the filling of evolutionary niches, places where an organism can make a living, including the emergence of sentient, self-aware organisms like us, is driven by the physical constants of our own universe. That's what really drives it. In other words, the emergence, not necessarily of the exact world we have today, but a world very much like the one we have today, is not a random accident. It's an outcome that is made possible, and some would say inevitable, although I think the jury is out on that, by the conditions in nature itself. And here I think is where we get to the boundary between science and faith. So I want to be explicit about this as well. To religious people, to people of faith, the fruitfulness of evolution, and evolution is a tremendously productive and fruitful process, can easily be understood as a reflection of what they would regard as divine creativity and promise. Now, not all scientists are people of faith, of course. So I would say to the non-religious, evolution is simply a property of nature itself. But either way, the study of nature is exactly the same. And this, I think, ultimately is why science is compatible with faith. And that is because either to people of faith or people who are not people of faith, the study of that natural world and the natural processes are the same. Now, people who worry about evolution often like to point out to me some pithy words occasionally written by Richard Dawkins, the great Oxford evolutionary biologist. I admire Richard tremendously, especially as a writer. I think with the death of Stephen Jay Gould, he is the best writer on evolutionary theory alive on the planet. But they point out that every now and then he strays a little bit from strict science. He's the author, of course, of The God Delusion, but in a really marvelous book called River Out of Eden, he wrote the following. The universe we know about from evolution has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Every time I hear that, I always wonder, how does Richard manage to get up in the morning? I mean, this is a guy who lives his life with more intensity of purpose than anyone I know, and yet he's talking about the purposelessness of the universe. And I've actually asked that question to Richard, and he says, the universe is purposeless, I am not. And I think that actually is a fair statement. But talking about the universe, this notion of purposelessness, I want you to consider something. And I want you to consider the kinds of windows that science has opened on that universe in recent years. This is an area that from Earth telescopes until a few years ago was just a fog, an intergalactic fog. With the better pictures from the Hubble Space Telescope, what do we see? We see galaxy after galaxy after galaxy after galaxy, each of these with anywhere from 50 to 100 million stars. We see a universe that is infinitely fruitful in terms of the possibility for life. Many of these stars surely have planets, and on many of them, perhaps like us, life may have evolved. That, to me, is the definition of a fruitful and productive universe, and it certainly does not suggest to me the same kind of universe that Dawkins would see. So if I was asked about that, what do we know about that, I might make this statement. The universe we know about from evolution has precisely the properties we should expect from the wisdom of a provident and purposeful God, intent upon a fruitful and dynamic world. Evolution is surely fruitful and dynamic, and committed to a promise of freedom that makes genuine love possible. Now, many of my scientific colleagues would say, it's nice that you think that, Ken, but that's not a scientific statement. And I would be the first one to say, you're right. But do you know what? Dawkins' statement wasn't scientific either, because it is not testable by the methods of science. There is no equation that I know of into which one can plug purpose as a quality. And that is, in fact, what one would have to do to make it scientific. But I would also argue that this kind of sentiment, and that's what Dawkins was too, a sentiment, is entirely consistent with what we know and we understand about the nature of the universe and the nature of life. Now, I'm not the only person who feels that way. Probably the greatest population geneticist of the 20th century was the late Theodosius Dobzhansky. In a famous essay that every biology teacher almost knows by heart, he wrote, and here's really the message, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And that was exactly true. If you walk the halls of this great university in its new biology building, you will see those words blazed on the tile of the biology department here. They fought long and hard to get those words in there, and they wanted them, and I understand why. But in this very same article, Dobzhansky wrote something that a lot of people miss. The organic diversity of life becomes reasonable and understandable if the Creator made the living world not by caprice, but by evolution propelled by natural selection. He then said, it is wrong to hold creation and evolution as mutually exclusive. I, Dobzhansky, am a creationist and an evolutionist. He was a person of faith. Why? Because according to him, evolution is God's or nature's method of creation. Creation is not an event that happened in 4004 BC. It's a process that began 10 billion years ago and is still underway. If you seek a more authoritative source, I would suggest Pope Benedict. He recently was asked on this a question about this issue by a group of Italian journalists, and among other things, he said the following. He said, the contrast between creation and evolution is an absurdity, because there are many scientific tests in favor of evolution, which appears as a reality that we must see and which enriches our understanding of life and being. Now, if that's too complicated for you, it is for me sometimes, just pick up a copy of the New York Post. They have a good way to boil things down, and here's what they said. Evolution and God do mix, Pope. In this case. You got to love the Post. I mean, it's just great. But, you know, every now and then, when I emphasize these points, I'm asked by people, but evolution is one of those modern scientific ideas, sort of like the Big Bang, you know, Einstein, guys like that. Is this really compatible with a faith based on Scripture? Einstein, despite his thoughts about religion, certainly would never have based his faith on Scripture. But I want to show you somebody who's about to stand next to Einstein in my picture, who did to some extent. And this is a guy who made fundamental scientific contributions. Einstein's equations describing general relativity imply an expanding universe. Although Einstein himself for 2 decades resisted the notion of an expanding universe, he preferred to be in a steady state one, largely because he didn't like the theological implications of it. Well, who is the person who worked through his equations and finally convinced him that the universe was expanding, which means at the past it emerged from a singularity? It was Georges Lemaitre, a Belgian priest trained in physics and mathematics. And it was Father Lemaitre who basically convinced Einstein this is right, and he is really the father of what we would call the Big Bang Theory today. There's a wonderful book about his life written by John Farrell, called The Day Without Yesterday. And it talks about Father Lemaitre's life and work and the extraordinary scientific work that he did to establish cosmic expansion theory as sort of the working paradigm of where our universe came from. Father Lemaitre was asked all the time, isn't the Big Bang in conflict with the Bible, with the Genesis story of creation? And here's what he said on one occasion. The writers of the Bible were illuminated more or less on the question of salvation. On other questions, they were just as wise or just as ignorant as their generation. So it is utterly unimportant that errors of historic or scientific fact should be found in the Bible, especially if those errors relate to events that were not directly observed by those who wrote about them. And that certainly implies to the book of Genesis. And Father Lemaitre went on and said that because the authors of Scripture were right in the doctrine of immortality and salvation, they also have to be right on all other subjects is simply a fallacy of people who have an incomplete understanding of why the Bible was given to us at all. And I think it's an extraordinarily well-put way to do this. Now, am I saying that the Bible should be read as a scientific textbook? The answer is of course not, if you've been listening to me tonight. But once again, you don't have to take my word for it or Father Lemaitre's. You can go back to St. Augustine. And in a remarkable book called On the Literal Meaning of Genesis, Augustine said this, and you can read this for yourself because the type is big, but I'm going to translate it into what I think it means in modern English. Even a non-believer can study geology, astronomy, zoology, botany, and other scientific fields, and gain scientific knowledge from observation and experiment. The worst thing that could happen would be for that non-believer to hear a Christian presumably explaining the Bible, talking nonsense on these scientific topics. We Christians have to do everything we can to prevent the embarrassment of non-believers showing up scientific ignorance in a Christian and laughing it to scorn. Augustine realized that if people use the Bible as a book of science and the scientific conclusions they make turn out to be incorrect, the non-believer will reject the real message of Scripture, which is the message of salvation. Now, I once pointed this out to an audience of scientists, and they had liked me up to the point where I quoted from Augustine. And at the end of the talk, somebody said, what kind of science would we get if we followed the precepts of some sort of weird 5th century mystic like Augustine? And knowing the field this particular scientist was in, I decided I would have some fun. And I decided, let me answer it this way. There once was a young man who was so taken by the precepts of Augustinian thought that he joined a religious order that was founded according to those precepts. He became a priest, a very religious one. He was highly regarded. You're not supposed to know who this is. That's not He was very highly regarded by his peers, and he eventually became the abbot of the Augustinian monastery of St. Thomas in Brunn in what is today the Czech Republic. At one point in his life, he got interested in what today we would call a scientific question. He wanted to understand how plants pass their characteristics along from one generation to another. So how did he answer the question? Did he read Scripture? Of course he did. He read it every day for the Roman office. Did he pray? He led the monastery in prayer. But to answer the scientific question, he went into the garden. And the name, of course, of that Augustinian priest was Father Gregor Mendel, the founder of the modern science of genetics. So what kind of science do you get if you follow Augustinian precepts? The answer is you get genetics. And the person who asked me the question was, in fact, a geneticist. And therefore, I thought it was an appropriate response, and I think it made a point. Now, we do have, within the scientific community in the United States today, an interesting little squabble. And the squabble concerns who should speak for science. Some people say, and this is a part of an essay by Jerry Coyne, an evolutionary biologist at the University of Chicago, that basically says those who address the concern of theists, of believers, are accommodationists who dishonor the rigorous nature of science. And therefore, we shouldn't even think about theological issues when we discuss science. On the other side of this issue are people like Darrell Dumning, who's an anatomy professor at Howard University in Washington, D.C., and he basically says in a religious nation like ours, people of faith are in fact the most effective spokespeople for science. So I've been asked many times, who should really speak for scientists? Which of these guys do you agree with? Who should speak for evolution? Is it a good idea to pick so-called theistic evolutionists, people like John Haught, professor of theology at Georgetown University, or Keith Miller, no relation, an evangelical Christian who's a professor of geology in Kansas, or for that matter, Francis Collins, the new director of the National Institutes of Health, who also is an outspoken Christian? Or should we pick atheistic evolutionists like Jerry Coyne, who wrote the article in question, Richard Dawkins, the great paleontologist Jenny Clack, or bloggers like P.Z. Myers? So what you have really is a large number of people all involved in the defense of evolution. Some atheists, they're in yellow, so you can pick them out. Some theists in white, so you can pick them out. And my answer is very simple. It's very straightforward. Everyone should speak for evolution because it is simply good science. And I think it does no harm to have people carry out their theological arguments in one sphere and then defend vigorously scientific rationality, either from a theistic or a materialist perspective, because that's the way science has always been conducted. I think one of the persons who put this best at the end of the Dover trial, as it turns out, was Charles Krauthammer. Charles Krauthammer is a very conservative columnist who writes for the Washington Post, and you can get his idea from the column that he wrote. He wrote, "Phony theory, false conflict. Intelligent design foolishly pits evolution against faith." And I love the way that Charles put it. He said, how ridiculous to make evolution the enemy of God. What could be more elegant, more simple, more brilliant, more economical, more creative, indeed more divine than a planet with millions of life forms, distinct yet interactive, all ultimately derived from accumulated variations in a single double-stranded molecule, pliable and fecund enough to give us mollusks and mice, Newton and Einstein, even if it also gave us the Kansas Board of Education. And I think that puts it very well. I can't think of a better way to sort of conclude my remarks, especially to this conference, than by citing the words of the person who kept this page in one of his research notebooks. And I'm sure almost everyone here recognizes this page. It's an extraordinary thing to see. It's been on exhibit in the United States for a while. I got a chance to see it myself at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. And when you open that page and you see, I think, and then you see this incredible diagram with the explanatory notes, it just sends shivers down your spine. It was amazing. And I'm often asked by people, what do you really think of evolution? Don't you find it depressing to think that you came from an animal or you evolved out of the muck or something like that? And my answer is usually what you're talking about is that you and I, all humanity, are part of a fabric of life that covers this entire planet. And I find that to be a rather grand idea. But I think the person who said it best was the person who kept that page in his notebook. And at the end of a famous book that everyone here knows, he responded to the question of whether evolution is a depressing idea or not. And here's what he wrote. He said, I believe there is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that while this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most wonderful and most beautiful, have been and are being evolved. That's the concluding sentence of The Origin of Species, and I think those are words to live by. Thank you very much.
So, I'm sure that Ken will entertain some questions. We'd like to thank him for a great, insightful, and thought-provoking seminar. And I remind you, afterwards there'll be a reception out in, I think it's in the hallway, that you can talk to Ken there as well. I want to remind you to step up to the microphones too, both on the lower level and up in the balcony if you have a question, so that we can all hear it and so it can get recorded for posterity's sake too. Questions? We've got some answers.
Maybe.
Maybe.
That depends. Sir.
My name is Ed Manier, and I am a retired prof here at Notre Dame. That passage you ended your lecture with is the same passage, of course, that you ended the search for Darwin's God with.
It is.
And I'm a bit concerned about that, in part because it's pretty clear from the historic record that Darwin was very careful about the rhetorical strategy that he used to present his views.
I agree.
And that some of the views that he had on this issue were, in any ordinary sense, not logically compatible with that apotheosis of evolution with which he ends the origin.
Sure.
So maybe that doesn't bother me so much if you express it as a view that you find very sympathetic. But it did bother me as a conclusion to the book Finding Darwin's God, because it seems to me that Darwin's views on that subject were often polemical, often vitriolic when it came to talking about the implications of theism for biology.
Sure.
Okay. So that's supposed to be.
Yeah, I'll answer it this way. First of all, when I read that last sentence, I love the sentence, and I think when he says grandeur in this view of life, I think he captures exactly what every biologist I know thinks about the evolutionary process, which is this is not only true, this is not only something with overwhelming evidence, but it's something that makes you think lofty thoughts in terms of our relationship and our responsibility to the rest of the living things on this planet. So that's why I adhere to that sentence and I endorse it. At the end of Finding Darwin's God, by quoting Darwin, any more than by quoting Churchill or quoting Lincoln, one is not subsuming one's own thought into everything else that person has ever thought or done, but rather picking up a particular quotation. At the end of Finding Darwin's God, I talked about a group of students asked me, what kind of God do I believe in? And the last sentence, and I haven't reread it myself for a long time, is something like that. I finally found the answer, I believe in Darwin's God. Now, what I meant by that was a God, and I think the context of the last chapter points this out. What I meant was not the kind of God that Charles Darwin believed in, because he didn't believe in God, but rather a God that was consistent with the Darwinian process and could have worked through it. Because one of the things that I tried to claim, perhaps successfully, perhaps unsuccessfully, was that if Darwin were around today to sort of understand some of the things we know about the nature of physics, about the indeterminate nature of matter and so forth, I think he might have been more hospitable to theism than he turned out to be in the end of his own life, dying near the end of a profoundly Newtonian century. The other thing that's worth noting is that Darwin was asked many times, especially as he became more prominent towards the end of his life, to basically engage in anti-religious crusades or otherwise endorse one project or another against faith and against religion. And he very consistently refused to allow his name to be used for that. And at one point, in correspondence with another person, he said, in contradiction to a suggestion he'd gotten in correspondence, he says, I do not doubt for a moment that a person can be a full-fledged evolution and an ardent theist. Those are Darwin's own words. And he cited as an example his first great scientific champion in the United States, the Harvard botanist Asa Gray, who was a devout Presbyterian. So I think what Darwin said, with some respect, was that he thought it was perfectly possible to fully embrace his theories and be the ardent theist that Asa Gray was, even if Darwin himself did not. But I thank you for your comment.
Yeah. I've got another quick one
Sure.
on
I don't see a big line back there, so fire away.
I looked around quickly. Francis Collins is director of NIH.
He is.
When Jerry Coyne argued that that was a mistake,
Yep.
I think he was looking at not so much the theistic question as a kind of institutional religious issue, where a man of faith might identify himself with a particular religious faction,
Yeah.
and in ways that might inhibit exploration of stem cell research,
Sure.
things of that sort. So I think I just don't like to see Jerry Coyne dismissed out of hand as blind to the fact that that theism and evolutionism are incompatible, when in fact what he's considering is the very real possibility that a structured religious institution might be inclined to interfere with the advance of science in areas like stem cell research.
Well, that's an interesting statement, and one of the things I will tell you is I do not dismiss Jerry Coyne out of hand. I disagree with him, and I answer him. You may know that when his nomination was being considered, Sam Harris, the author of Letter to a Christian Nation, wrote quite a long op-ed piece in the New York Times, very prominently opposing Francis Collins' nominations for the exact reasons also given by Jerry Coyne. 3 days later, the New York Times was kind enough to publish my letter in response to that, which is also freely available on the web. And what I argued in this is that the opinions of Coyne and Harris, and with all due respect, some of the sentiments that you just expressed, would do something that is actually prohibited by the American Constitution, which is to establish a religious test for public office, something that is explicitly prohibited in our Constitution. There shall never be a religious test for public office. And what's more important to me in the empirical sense is it's not as though Dr. Collins has never held a sensitive position of scientific administration. For a decade, he was the director of the Human Genome Project. And the question is, does he and did he have any record at any time of allowing his religious views to suppress, distort, or twist science? And the answer to that is a very clear and very obvious no. And with the particulars, with respect to Francis Collins on stem cell research, embryonic stem cell research, you should know he's a supporter of it.
Yeah. I don't want to advocate the establishment of religion.
Yes, but when you say any person associated with an established religion would be dangerous as the head of a scientific enterprise, that's exactly what you're talking about.
Hi, I had a question about your discussion of chance and randomness.
Sure.
And it seemed like you were making the argument that, well, it might seem that mutations are random, but actually, if a lineage didn't have mutations, then it would soon die out. Therefore, mutations are non-random.
No, I didn't say that at all.
Okay.
That's absolutely not what I said. If you remember what the slide said, are they mistakes?
Right.
I didn't say random. I said mistakes. And then the notion, therefore, is...
Right, but is it you...
No, but hang on. I did use the word random in a different context, but not that one.
Right.
When I said it would die out, therefore it's not a mistake. I didn't say an organism that didn't mutate would die out, therefore they're not random.
Right.
Didn't say that at all.
Right.
What I did say a couple slides later is evolution is not random.
Right.
And what I mean by not random is not that it's straight pipeline predictable, but rather it's not random in the sense that just anything happens. Evolution is constrained by the developmental realities of an organism, by natural selection, which is distinctly a non-random process, and by the laws of physics and chemistry.
Right. Although it seems, I mean, you tied it into the Simon Conway Morris, Stephen Jay Gould sort of debates, and it seems that that's actually a totally different issue about whether mutations are random or whether there's a certain basal mutation rate is selected for. One could decide on that question. Then there's the other question about, say, Stephen Jay Gould's contingency hypothesis.
Right.
Because that's really a statement about if the starting conditions were different, would we have a very different outcome?
Indeed.
And so you could hold. It seemed to me that was an independent argument than the statements about, say, are certain basal mutation rates selected for or not.
Yeah, right. But
okay.
Once again, you said your statement, Miller, about mutations being random. I didn't say that. I didn't say anything about mutations random or not. What I said was the evolutionary process is not random in the sense that you get anything. What I was talking about mutations is whether or not they're truly mistakes.
Right.
And in the sense that a non-mutational organism wouldn't survive, therefore mutations have to be there for life essentially to survive. And what I'm trying to argue is this. What I'm trying to argue is that the evolutionary process basically doesn't just split off anywhere. The realities of physiology, development, natural selection constrain it in certain ways. So for example, Professor Ayala earlier today gave us two examples of a camera-like lens and retina eye. And he gave us the example of the eye as we vertebrates have, and a very similar looking eye in the optical sense that mollusks have. Those eyes developed, perhaps, from basal photoreceptor genes, but they came about in entirely different developmental pathways, so that the vertebrate eye, in a sense, is wired backwards, with the neural circuitry actually facing the incoming light, whereas the mollusk eye is wired the proper way, you might say, with the wires, the neural wiring on the other side. Yet, they look almost identical in optical terms. Why is it? Well, the reason for that is natural selection drives both of them, according to the laws of geometrical optics. And since both of those are selected for in terms of being a light capturing and light sensing device, the laws of physics, which relate refraction and light sensing, basically drive natural selection to produce almost an identical solution in two unrelated organisms. That's what I mean about evolution not being random. You don't just get any old eye, you get an eye that's constrained by the laws of optical physics.
Right. Well, part of there's sort of an ambiguity about randomness, because randomness, in one sense, is that the outcome is not perfectly determined by the starting conditions.
And I certainly agree with that.
And then another one is that all outcomes are equally probable.
Yes,
rolling
and
a die,
I do not agree with that.
Right. If you roll a die, it's a random process, even though it's constrained and that there's only, say, 6 possibilities of a 6-sided die.
Yeah, and you brought up the argument between Conway Morris and Gould.
Right.
And Gould articulated his side of the argument brilliantly. I mean, really brilliantly, because Steve was a great writer. In his book, Wonderful Life.
Right.
A year or two after Wonderful Life was published, there were dueling side-by-side essays by Gould and Simon Conway Morris in Natural History magazine. And if you read the two essays, with all due respect to Simon, if you read the two essays, it's obvious who the master of prose style is, and that's Stephen Jay Gould. That's the reason you have all those wonderful books. But in my own point of view, the person who carried the weight of the scientific argument in terms of the pathway of evolution was Conway Morris. And I think basically his arguments about evolutionary contingency, which I know he will elaborate on here, to me are very persuasive.
Right. And just one last point
Sure.
about the mutations being a mistake. It seems what I would agree with is that the fact that organisms have a basal mutation rate is not a mistake, but that particular mutations are still mistakes. I mean, it depends on how they're understood. A lot of times, mistakes are talked about in, say, biochemistry in a non-fitness related way.
Yeah.
It's just that it's so if it's understood in that way, then there's no sense in which it's not problematic to talk about them as mistakes.
Yeah,
but you shouldn't imply that they're selected against, or that having some mutation rate is selected against.
Yeah, no, I know. I hope I am not implying that. And
right.
For those of you who are about to go get X-rays for one purpose or another, there are good reasons to cover your genitalia with a lead shield and lower the mutation rate in your own reproductive cells. And I hope everybody does that.
Right.
But
you might get a good payoff, but there's a low probability.
You see, what I'm trying to respond to in that is a certain cachet that is applied to evolution, which is to say, if evolution produced us, since evolution is driven by mistakes, we are a mistake of nature. And I don't think we are a mistake of nature. I think we are a property of nature.
Right. Thanks.
Jim Salmon.
Father Salmon, nice to see you.
Would you say that two characteristics of evolution, I heard you say, but I don't know if it's true, were 1, ingenuity, and 2, trial and error? What would you say about those two characteristics of evolution?
Trial and error, for sure. Ingenuity in a retrospective way. And what I mean by ingenuity in a retrospective way is when you look at a signal transduction pathway inside a cell, or one of those molecular machines that my friend Michael Behe is so fond of, like the bacterial flagellum, you see ingenious solutions to problems. You don't always see the best solutions. You don't always see the solution that a skillful engineer would come up with, but you often see ingenuity. But the appreciation of the ingenuity is kind of retrospective. You might say, that's not the way I would have done it, but it certainly does work. But trial and error, there's no question about it. Indeed.
I'm probably going to embarrass myself here, but I read that book by Michael Behe, Darwin's Black Box, and he talked about the flagellum mechanism and the blood clotting. And he makes a claim that, no evolutionist has ever come up with a mechanism, to how those evolved. Now, is that, he couldn't find anything, through all the literature search that he did that to show any example of that. Is that just a flat-out lie, or, can you
I would certainly not say it was a lie. I would say it was not true. And the reason for that, and I wrote a review of Michael Behe's book right after it was published, and several other people did similar things, and I came up with 30 or 40 papers which illustrate the evolution of a complex biochemical system. Now, not the exact ones that he picked, but he made a broader charge. He didn't just say, I haven't figured out the flagellum yet. He says, no one has ever figured out any complicated biochemical system. And I was very quick, because I had taught about this to my biochemistry classes, to show there are several papers on the evolution of the Krebs cycle, which is a very complex biochemical system and is now very well understood in Darwinian terms. But the thing that I think was incorrect, and is flatly incorrect about Dr. Behe's assertion, is he argues that these complicated biochemical systems are irreducibly complex, meaning if they've got 10, 20, 30, 40 proteins, all of these components have to be put together before you have any function. What he literally said was that an irreducibly complex system cannot be produced by any precursor system with a smaller number of parts, because any precursor system that is missing a part is, by definition, non-functional. Okay, very flat statement. Now, I didn't show it tonight because I had other things I wanted to talk about. But in the case of the flagellum, that is remarkably easy to disprove. There are about 35 proteins in the bacterial flagellum. According to his claim, if you took away one or two, you should have absolutely no function. Well, you don't have to take away just one or two. You can take away about 25 and have exactly 10 proteins left. The 10 proteins in the base of the bacterial flagellum are precisely homologous to 10 proteins making up an entirely different device called the type 3 secretory system. This is a little molecular syringe that bacteria use to pump poisons into our cells. These are bacteria that don't have flagella, but these 10 proteins are perfectly functional in an entirely different context. Now, that doesn't show how the flagellum evolved, but it does show that the notion that simpler parts which could have contributed to the flagellum are absolutely functionless until all the parts are put together, which is his thesis, that's wrong. In the blood clotting cascade, again, in that book, Pandas and People, in his own book, he said, all of the proteins have to be there for blood to clot or the system fails. It turns out that whales and dolphins are missing one of the proteins. They're missing factor 12. That all bony fish are missing 3 of the proteins, and that lamprey are missing 5 or 6 of the proteins, and their blood clots just fine. So the testable elements of his thesis in that book have turned out to be wrong. That's the problem.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Sure. Everett Hamner. I'm an assistant professor of English, actually, at Western Illinois University. Ken, I wanted to throw a quick suggestion up there for you to play with for a minute. My reading of 20th century American fiction shows a move from the Scopes trial, where there is a model of warfare, of conflict between science and religion, to a gradual conflation through the mid-century into increasing efforts to more productively interpenetrate science and religion as the century moves to an end. Now, that's a quick sketch, but my question is this. Is the warfare model and the metaphors that you were using ones that we ought to maintain in order to defend what many of us agree are very valid evolutionary discoveries? Or would it be possible for our stories, the stories we tell, whether in nonfiction or in fictional forms, to produce something even more powerful?
Yeah, I've always thought the warfare model was a bad one. And it was a bad one only because, in a sense, it is the nations of the West, Western Europe in particular, who gave rise to what today we call modern science. So in many respects, modern science was really a creature of Western Christianity. There's a book by, I think it's David Heilbronn, called The Light in the Church. And this is a book that talks about the way in which medieval cathedrals were constructed as astronomical observatories. And in a way, for much of the Middle Ages, the church was, for want of a better word, the funding agency for an awful lot of basic science, certainly as it concerns astronomy and some of the physical sciences. So I've never been satisfied with the warfare model. And I certainly don't think, and this is something that my colleagues like Jerry Coyne and Sam Harris and other people do think, that the way to increase, I do not think that the way to increase scientific understanding is to use science as a weapon against religion until religion is absolutely stamped out. I think the right way to do it is basically to show that science itself is a useful and valuable human enterprise, and explain to people of faith that if God is real, he gave us two gifts. He gave us faith and reason, and ultimately they should both be compatible, and I think that's how people of faith can understand science.
Oh, this is the last one? Yeah, Kenneth Kim from University of St. Thomas. It always seems to me that we Christians who take evolution seriously are a bit caught in a crossfire. On one side, we get the anti-Christian or the atheistic evolutionists, and the other side, the Christian anti-evolutionists. I feel like you're getting shot at from both directions.
Yeah, tell me about it.
Pardon? Yeah, well, I know, but when you actually give the presentation, it seems like your fire's aimed much more in one direction than the other. Not completely, of course. But I mean, the tone changes a lot when you're talking about the bad guys on the kind of Christian anti-evolution side from what it does when you're talking about the atheistic evolutionists. I think they, from the days of Huxley and Haeckel, have made lots of problems for us, and they deserve being shot at a little bit more. Well, it is, I guess, to revive a kind of a war, but a different one.
I'm going to warn you that based on what you just said, at the University of Kansas about a year and a half ago, I was speaking in a series called Difficult Dialogues. And I used slides, as I always do, say, here's what I think the problem is. And that is Christians, and they have a little icon for Christians there, have seen this idea called evolution, and they've seen an atheistic interpretation of evolution, which contradicts their faith. So they've assumed reflexively that the right thing to do is to go after evolution and attack it per se. Well, I got news for them. Evolution is the theory that people have tried to disprove with more vigor and more intensity than any other theory I can name in science. Those attempts have been going for a century and a half. They haven't worked out, and I don't think they're going to work out. This is the reason I said I'm going to warn you. What I then said is what Christians should really be shooting at is an atheistic interpretation of evolution. They should provide their own. The use of the word shoot was then picked up, I'm not making this up, by about 10 different bloggers saying that I had called for violence against atheists. And I'm quite serious about this. I had people, saying that the professors at the University of Colorado, my graduate alma mater, this is true, had received death threats because they had spoken out for evolution. That a University of Kansas professor had allegedly been beaten up for being outspoken on evolution and so forth, and this was dangerous and irresponsible. So like I said, one of the things I've discovered is people are touchy in terms of how this stuff is actually described. So when I heard you use the word shooting, I thought, oh boy, not him too. Hopefully you don't have a lot of bloggers here and you won't be in trouble tomorrow. But yeah, I've been told that by some people, that I've been outspoken that way. And to be perfectly honest, I'm doing what I feel the most at home with and the most, and I feel does the most good. And let me try to explain something as to why I slant things, if that's the way you want to put the way I do. I see around the country organized attempts by people who are opponents of evolution to corrupt science curriculum, to pressure science teachers, to rewrite science standards, and to censor textbooks. I do not see, I'm not making this up, I do not see organized attempts by the likes of Jerry Coyne or Richard Dawkins to write atheism into the science curriculum, to say that these processes occurred without any involvement by God. If I saw that in the science textbook, I'd be livid. But because I don't see that, that's really where my efforts are. And for the most part, when I look at the two sides in this debate, I've been quite critical of both. I was very happy to take on Sam Harris and the Francis Collins issue. When the Templeton Foundation asked me to debate in print Christopher Hitchens on the issue of whether or not science excludes God. I did that, and I did so gleefully, and I'm always happy to do that. Last year, I debated the issue of science and God with Michael Shermer at the annual meeting of the Skeptics Society in Los Angeles. So I was happy to walk into an auditorium of 550 atheists and agnostics and hold up for faith. So I'm happy to do it. But what I don't see in the sphere that is something that I care about immediately, which is the science classroom in this country, I do not see the materialist side as being a corrupting threat for the science curriculum, and I do see the anti-evolution side as being a corrupting threat. And that's the reason I pay such attention to it.